Harlan Pruitt had been selling frontier land long enough to read a room before a single word was spoken. 11 years behind folding tables outside territorial offices had taught him things no manual could. He knew which men would file quickly and which would circle the maps like dogs unsure of a scent. He knew the difference between confidence and desperation, and he knew that both spent money at roughly the same speed. On this particular morning in late April of 1884, he had spread the survey maps across his table outside the Cass County Land Office in Nebraska and watched a line of 26 men form before the ink on the plats was fully dry. The air carried the sharp edge of a prairie spring that hadn't decided whether it was done with winter, and the men breathed small clouds as they bent over the paper, their fingers tracing section lines with the acquisitive focus of gamblers studying a wheel they believed they could predict. Each man pointed to the same kind of ground: high ridge plots, well-drained upland slopes with good southern exposure, parcels that caught the wind and shed the rain, and sat at elevations that made a man feel he was standing on something solid rather than something that might swallow his investment the first time the sky opened up. One after another, they claimed what the land itself seemed to advertise as valuable: open, dry, promising ground that looked exactly the way farming land was supposed to look. Pruitt initialed their papers, collected their filing fees, and watched the best parcels disappear before noon. He did this without commentary because commentary was not part of the service, but he noticed things. He noticed that every man in that line performed the same calculation, reached the same conclusion, and selected with the same logic. There was a comfort in that unanimity. There was also, he would later reflect, a blindness. By mid-afternoon, the table had thinned to the parcels nobody wanted. The men still lingering had the resigned quality of people reconciling themselves to second choices. They circled the remaining options with the grim arithmetic of settlers whose timing had cost them the premium selections, and who now had to decide whether a mediocre claim was better than no claim at all. Among the remaining plats sat number 47. It was a quarter section of low basin ground wrapped on three sides by a long, gentle curve of hill that rose 60 feet above the basin floor at its highest point. A seasonal creek ran through the eastern edge of the property, its banks dark with the heavy soil that moisture-rich ground accumulates over decades of slow, patient work that nobody plans and nobody controls. At the center of the parcel, the survey notes marked a natural depression that pooled standing water after every significant rain and held it for days, sometimes weeks, before the ground slowly drew it down. Every man in that line read those features the same way: too wet, too sheltered. The low position meant it would never drain properly, and standing water meant root rot disease in fields that couldn't be worked until weeks after higher ground had already been planted and was well into its first growth. The hills curving around on three sides would block afternoon sun in winter, shorten the growing season at both ends, and catch cold air that settled into the basin like smoke into a hollow, pooling through the night, lying thick over the plants at the hour when frost did its killing work. The last man to examine Plat 47 was a broad-shouldered Iowan who crouched at the table for 2 full minutes, studying the contour lines. He ran his finger along the creek path, paused at the depression marker, and then straightened up and shook his head in the private way of a man who has considered something carefully and found it wanting. He walked away without a word. The parcel sat alone on the table in the afternoon light. Then a woman walked up. She was 38 years old, medium height, with the kind of hands that had done serious work for 2 decades. The knuckles were prominent, and the skin across her palms carried the particular thickness that comes not from a single season of labor, but from years of repetition, years of gripping tools and pulling rope, and working soil until the body reshapes itself around the demands placed upon it. She wore a dark wool dress that had been mended carefully at the sleeves and a hat that had traveled a long distance from wherever it had been new. She came alone. This was unusual enough to draw quiet attention from the men still lingering near the office. A woman filing a land claim without a husband or a father or a brother standing beside her was not unheard of in 1884, but it was uncommon enough to generate the specific quality of observation that falls somewhere between curiosity and concern, the look people give to something they are not sure they should be witnessing. Before she reached the table, she paused. She looked down at her left hand and her thumb moved across the ring finger in a small, unconscious gesture, touching the place where a wedding band had once sat. The skin there was slightly paler than the surrounding finger, a faint indentation that the months since Louisville had not yet erased. She had sold the ring to buy seed. She had made that trade with the clear-eyed practicality of a woman who understood that sentiment does not germinate and gold does not grow, and that the living require different currency than the dead. She stepped to the table and began studying the remaining plats. Not with the anxious speed of someone making the best of bad options, but with the slow, methodical attention of someone reading a document she needed to understand completely before signing. She traced the contour lines with one finger, moving from elevation markers to creek paths to soil annotations with the focused patience of someone who knew what each of those marks meant and what they implied about the ground they described. Pruitt watched her. He had seen enough settlers to recognize the difference between confusion and calculation. This woman was calculating. She pointed to Plat 47. Pruitt looked at her with something close to genuine concern. In 11 years of selling land, he had developed a sense of obligation toward the buyers that went slightly beyond the transactional. He did not enjoy watching people make mistakes that would cost them years. "Ma'am, I want to be straight with you about that piece," he said. "That's basin ground. That creek floods in April most years. You'll have standing water through May some seasons. The soil gets waterlogged and you can't work it until weeks after higher ground is already planted. There are better choices still available if you would consider." "I know what it is," she said. She pulled the filing fee from a small cloth purse, counted the coins out on the table with the deliberate precision of someone who had counted that money more than once before arriving, and signed her name in the careful, upright hand of a woman who had learned to write with intention. Margaret Holbrooke. The letters were clear and unhurried. A voice carried from several feet away. Clayton Sutter, who had filed on the highest and most prominent parcel in the township earlier that morning, was standing with a loose group of men near the office door. He was a large man with a large voice and the particular confidence of someone who had succeeded elsewhere and assumed that success would follow him like a well-trained dog to whatever new place he chose to stand. "Before Christmas," Sutter said, not quite to Margaret, but not quite to anyone else either. Just to the air between them, pitched at the volume that ensured she would hear. "I'll put $5 on it. That ground comes back to market before the snow." A man beside him laughed. It was not a cruel laugh exactly. It was the comfortable laugh of agreement, the sound men make when someone has said aloud what they were all thinking privately, and the saying of it has released a small pressure that unanimity always generates. Margaret did not turn around. She folded her papers, placed them in her coat pocket, and walked toward a wagon at the edge of the road. The wagon was loaded with the modest inventory of a woman starting from nothing. A trunk, some tools, a boy. Pruitt watched her go. He would think about that moment several times over the following years. He would think about the steadiness of her hand when she signed and the way she had traced those contour lines and the particular quality of certainty in her voice when she said she knew what the land was. He would wonder what she had seen in those elevation marks, in creek paths, and soil notations that every experienced man in the line had looked at and put down without finishing. The boy sitting in the wagon was 12 years old. His name was Thomas, though his mother called him Tom, and he had his father's serious eyes and the watchful stillness of a child who has learned through recent experience that the world can remove important things without warning, and that the appropriate response is to pay very close attention to whatever remains. Tom watched his mother climb onto the wagon seat. He did not ask her what she had chosen or why. He had learned in the 14 months since his father's death that his mother made decisions the way his father had made decisions, quietly and completely, and that asking questions before she was ready to explain produced answers that were patient but incomplete, as though she were translating from a language he did not yet speak. Margaret guided the wagon south toward the piece of ground that would either prove her right or prove 26 men right, and the afternoon light fell across the Nebraska prairie with the indifferent clarity of a sky that did not care which outcome prevailed. She had not chosen Plat 47 because it was all that was left. She had chosen it because she had looked at what was left and read it more accurately than the men who had already chosen. But this distinction would take 5 years and considerable suffering to establish. And on this afternoon, it existed only as a private conviction carried in the mind of a woman driving a wagon toward low ground that everyone she had just met believed would break her. The conviction had a source, and the source had a name, and the name was Henry Holbrooke, and he had been dead for 14 months. Henry had been a surveyor and a farmer in the floodplain country along the Ohio River in Kentucky. His family had worked bottomland for 3 generations, an unbroken chain of knowledge that passed from grandfather to son through the specific medium of shared labor. You did not learn the Holbrooke method from a book. You learned it by standing in mud beside someone who understood mud season after season, until the understanding transferred itself through proximity and repetition into your own hands and your own judgment. What the Ohio bottomland had taught the Holbrooke family, and what Henry had taught Margaret through 12 growing seasons of working beside him, was something that contradicted the most basic assumption of every settler standing in Harlan Pruitt's line. The low places where water gathered and lingered were not fail ground. They were collection points, terrain features that the landscape had been building over centuries to concentrate the very things that made soil productive. Every rain that fell on the surrounding hillsides eventually moved downward, carrying dissolved minerals stripped from the upper soil layers, carrying the finest suspended particles of organic material that slow-moving water holds until it finally loses energy and lets its burden settle. Over decades and centuries, those low basins accumulated the richest silt, the densest organic matter, the most concentrated mineral wealth that the surrounding landscape produced. The Ohio River floodplain had demonstrated this at enormous scale. The bottomlands that drove people off in spring produced extraordinary harvests in summer precisely because the flood had deposited what it carried and retreated, leaving behind soil of almost impossible fertility. Henry's grandfather had understood this. Henry's father had refined the understanding into practice. Henry had refined the practice into a system of records, keeping ledgers of rainfall and yield and soil color the way other men kept financial accounts, because numbers were honest in a way that memory was not. Margaret had worked beside Henry through all of it. She had learned to read soil color and interpret drainage patterns and understand the relationship between water movement and mineral deposition, not as abstract science, but as practical knowledge that determined whether a family ate well or scraped by. When Henry died of a lung sickness in the winter of 1882, she had lost her husband and her partner, and the man who had translated 3 generations of accumulated knowledge into the daily language of their shared work. What she had not lost was the knowledge itself that lived in her hands and her eyes, and the particular habit of attention that 12 seasons of careful observation had built into the structure of her thinking. She had sold the Kentucky farm because a bottomland operation required two adults to manage, and she was one. She had packed Henry's surveying tools, three good knives, enough seed to start a garden, and a rolled canvas sack of soil samples she had taken from the best producing fields along the Ohio before leaving. The soil samples were not sentimental, they were reference material. She intended to compare them to whatever she found in Nebraska, the way a translator carries a dictionary into unfamiliar territory. She had looked at Plat 47 and seen what Pruitt and every man in that line had missed entirely. The hills curving around three sides would deflect the killing frost winds that swept across the open prairie, not shelter her plants from light, but shield them from the specific kind of cold air movement that destroyed tender crops in May and early September, when exposed ridge ground could drop 10 degrees below what the sheltered basin held. The creek represented not a floating problem, but a guaranteed water supply in a region where drought was not a possibility, but a mathematical certainty. And the dark soil noted in the survey annotations, that deep near black shade that experienced farmers anywhere in the world learned to associate with organic wealth, told her that decades of water-carried sediment had deposited on that basin floor a layer of topsoil so rich that the neighboring high-ground farmers would spend lifetimes trying to build what she was about to stand on by default. She was not gambling. She was reading a document that the other men had looked at and put down without finishing. But she was also on this wagon ride toward Plat 47, thinking about a letter that would arrive 3 weeks later from Agnes Holbrooke in Kentucky. She did not know the letter was coming, but she knew Agnes, and she knew what Agnes thought about this journey, and the knowing sat in her chest like a stone she had chosen to carry because putting it down would mean pretending it did not exist. The first weeks on Plat 47 were physically brutal in the way that all frontier beginnings were brutal. Tom was strong for his age and willing, and Margaret worked beside him from first light to last with the focused efficiency of someone who had calculated exactly what needed to happen in what order and understood that the margin between success and failure in a first season was measured not in acres but in days. She did not build a large cabin first, which was the conventional approach. She built a small one, tight and low-positioned on the slightly higher northern edge of the property, where the ground stayed drier, and she spent the majority of her early energy on something that puzzled every neighbor who rode past. She was digging channels. Not drainage channels, though. That was what the neighbors assumed when they saw the work from the ridge. She was building a water management system, a network of shallow trenches designed not to remove water, but to distribute it evenly across the field surface, controlling where it pooled and where it moved on. She had spent her first 2 weeks on the property, walking the basin in rain, and after rain marking with small stakes where the water sat longest and where it moved fastest, mapping the topography of the water as a separate layer over the topography of the land. What she designed with her shovel was a way to make those two maps work together rather than against each other. Bottomland farmers along the Ohio had been managing seasonal flooding with earthwork channels for 3 generations in her family alone, and the technique had roots that went back further than anyone had bothered to trace. She was not innovating. She was importing a proven system into a landscape where the settlers around her were still treating every wet ground problem as evidence that the land was fundamentally hostile. She finished the channel system in 3 weeks, and the standing water sorted itself into defined pools and defined dry paths between them. Earl Dawson rode down to the fence line on a Tuesday afternoon in late April. Dawson was a decent man whose land sat on the ridge a quarter-mile north, and he had the genuine sympathy that characterized most of what the neighbors directed at the widow on the low ground. He watched Margaret and the boy working in the basin, cutting trenches in the mud with a precision that looked deliberate but whose purpose he could not identify, and he called out with the warmth of someone who truly believed he was helping. "Mrs. Holbrook, I have to tell you, you might be wasting your labor there. That ground won't drain out no matter what you cut into it. Creek feeds it too steady." Margaret straightened and looked at him. She had mud to her elbows, and her hair had come loose from its pins, and she was breathing hard from the work. And she looked at Earl Dawson with the patient expression of a woman who had decided not to explain herself until the results made explanation unnecessary. "Thank you, Mr. Dawson," she said. "I appreciate the thought." She went back to digging. Dawson did not leave immediately. He sat on his horse for another minute, watching Tom on the other side of a channel trench. The boy was 12 knee-deep in mud, working a shovel that was slightly too long for him with a determination that compensated for technique. Dawson had a son the same age. He thought the thing that decent people think in that situation: this child should be in school, not standing in a ditch paying for his mother's mistake. He thought it but did not say it. He touched the brim of his hat and turned his horse back up the hill. That same week, Ruth Gatlin arrived. Ruth was the wife of the most prosperous farmer in the township and carried the social influence that prosperity confers in small communities, where the church is the center of civic life. She came in a clean wagon with a basket of fresh bread and an expression that Margaret recognized instantly: compassion arranged to look like neighborliness, but with pity visible underneath like a foundation showing through thin paint. "I heard you took the lot down in the basin," Ruth said. "If you need help or if things don't work out the way you're hoping, we have a relief fund at the church for families going through a hard stretch." Margaret thanked her and accepted the bread. After Ruth left, Margaret stood at the edge of her half-finished channel and watched the wagon climb the hill road back toward the ridge. Tom, digging on the far side of a trench, saw his mother's face change. Not anger. Something harder than anger and quieter. The particular expression of determination compressing itself to avoid becoming words. That evening, eating supper at the small table in the small cabin, Tom asked, "That lady meant well, right?" Margaret looked at him. She chewed and swallowed and considered her son's question with the seriousness she gave all his questions, because Tom asked few and therefore meant each one. "She did," Margaret said. "She meant well the way people bring flowers to a funeral. The intention is real, but they've already decided who's in the casket." Tom laughed. It was the first time he had laughed since they arrived in Nebraska, and the sound of it in the small cabin that did not yet have enough furniture to absorb echoes was louder than two people should have been able to produce. Margaret laughed too, and for a moment the cabin felt less empty, and the work ahead felt less enormous, and the memory of Henry felt less like an absence and more like a presence that had simply stepped outside and would return when the weather improved. She planted corn on the slightly elevated beds between her channels, denser than local practice suggested was wise. Along the wet margins, she planted a variety of millet that the Holbrooke family had cultivated in Kentucky for bottomland conditions. Willows went along the creek edge for erosion control. In the deepest depression, where standing water persisted longest, she planted nothing, letting the natural vegetation establish itself as a moisture indicator she would read the following spring. In mid-May, a letter arrived from Kentucky. Agnes Holbrook's handwriting was angular and precise, the penmanship of a woman who had been taught that proper letters reflected proper character, and who applied that standard with the consistency of someone who believed that standards were the last defense against disorder. The letter read the way Agnes spoke, controlled, formal, and carrying the weight of a grief that had transformed itself into judgment, because judgment was easier to sustain than sorrow. I do not understand why you would take that boy to a wilderness. Henry would never have wanted this. You sold everything my son built. If you cannot provide for Thomas properly in that place, send him home to me. A child needs a stable home, not an adventure. Margaret read the letter twice. She folded it and placed it inside Henry's ledger between the last page he had written and the first page she had written, as though the letter belonged in the space between their two handwritings. She did not reply that night, but she lay awake in the dark and allowed herself the question she had been holding at arm's length since the wagon left Kentucky. What if Agnes was right? Not about the land. Margaret knew the land. She had staked everything on a reading of soil and water and terrain that she trusted, the way she trusted gravity. But about Tom, did she have the right to bet her son's future on a calculation she believed, but had not yet proven? Henry would have said, "Read the dirt, Maggie." She knew that. But Henry was dead, and the dead always agree with whatever you need them to agree with, and that was not comfort. That was loneliness wearing a different name. She lay with that question until the darkness outside the window began to show the faint gray edge of a prairie dawn. Then she got up and started working because the land did not wait for questions to be answered, and the channels needed finishing, and the corn needed planting. And the only reply to doubt that she had ever trusted was evidence, and evidence required time, and time required surviving long enough to accumulate it. By late June, the corn was up. By mid-July, it was extraordinary. Tom was the first to notice. He was standing at the fence line one evening looking north toward Dawson's fields on the ridge, then looking back at their own base of corn. He did not say anything. But that night, when Margaret opened Henry's ledger to record her daily observations, Tom sat down across from her and asked a question she had not expected. "Mom, was Dad ever wrong about dirt?" Margaret put down her pen. She thought about it the way she thought about everything Tom asked, seriously and without rushing toward an answer that would sound better than it was true. "Yes," she said. "Third year in Kentucky, he planted beans on the north margin and lost everything to late frost. He wrote 2 words in the ledger: wrong and never again." She paused. "That's how your father learned. He made a mistake, he wrote it down, and he never made it again." Tom was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're not wrong this time." It was not a question. The harvest came in October of 1884, and the numbers were impossible to dismiss. Margaret's corn yielded 43 bushels per acre. The ridge ground average across Cass County that year was 26. Earl Dawson came in at 28. A farmer named Delbert Sums, working what everyone agreed was excellent upland soil, hit 31 and considered it a strong year. Clayton Sutter, on the highest and most coveted parcel in the township, produced 33 and told anyone who would listen that he had outperformed the county average by a comfortable margin. When the yield figures circulated through the county newspaper in late October, the name Margaret Holbrooke sat at the top of the list. It meant nothing to most readers because nobody had been paying attention to the widow on the wet ground. Within the immediate neighborhood, though, it was noticed. At church the following Sunday, Clayton Sutter stood with a group of men near the entrance and spoke in the voice he used when he wanted something heard without appearing to direct it at anyone in particular. "A wet spring helps low ground," he said. "Everyone knows that. One season doesn't mean a thing. Next year will tell it different." Ruth Gatlin, standing nearby, nodded. It was a small nod, the kind that costs nothing to give and commits to nothing specific, but Margaret saw it from the back pew where she sat with Tom, and she recognized in that nod the particular mechanics of social consensus. Sutter supplied the narrative, and Ruth supplied the agreement. And between the two of them, the community had been given permission to set aside what the numbers said and continue believing what they had always believed. Margaret's hands tightened on the edge of the pew until her knuckles showed white. She said nothing. There was nothing to say that the soil had not already said more clearly than words could manage. And one season's testimony, however loud, was not enough to overturn the comfortable certainty of men who had built their understanding of farming on assumptions they had never been forced to question. After the service outside the church, Dawson walked past Margaret. He slowed. He was a man who chose his moments and his words with the careful economy of someone who understood that both had consequences, and he was not yet ready to say publicly what he was beginning to think privately. But he stopped, and he looked at her, and he said 3 words. "Good numbers, Mrs. Holbrooke." 3 words. But he said them where Sutter could hear, and Sutter heard, and that had weight. Margaret drove the wagon home with Tom beside her. The autumn light was gold on the ridge and cool blue in the basin, and the stubble of her harvested corn stood in rows that ran straight and even across ground that every man in Cass County had believed would grow nothing worth counting. She did not feel triumphant. Triumph was for people who needed an audience, and what Margaret needed was time. Time for the soil to repeat what it had just said. Time for the repetition to become a pattern, and the pattern to become proof, and the proof to become the kind of knowledge that even Clayton Sutter could not nod away. That night, she opened Henry's ledger. She recorded the harvest numbers with the careful precision that the ledger demanded. Then she turned back to the first page where Henry's handwriting began, and she rested her hand on the paper for a moment, the way a person rests a hand on a headstone, not expecting a response, but needing the contact. She turned to a fresh page and wrote "First season." The ground responded exactly as I calculated. The channels worked. Sutter bet I would quit before Christmas. Christmas has passed. She closed the ledger. Through the window, the basin was dark, but she knew where the water was, out there, what it was doing, what it was leaving behind. One season proved nothing. She knew that with the clinical clarity of a woman who understood probability. But one season was enough to know that the math was not wrong, and the math not being wrong was the only foundation she had, and it would have to hold the weight of everything she intended to build on top of it. The winter that followed the first harvest taught Margaret Holbrooke something that 12 seasons in Kentucky had not prepared her for. Kentucky winters were hard, but they were hard in the company of neighbors who understood what you were doing and why you were doing it. Nebraska winters were hard in isolation, and isolation had a weight that cold alone could not produce. She bought 2 milk cows and a young draft horse with the harvest profits. The animals gave the small property the quality of a working farm rather than an experiment, and Margaret spent the gray weeks of December and January extending her channel system along the outer margins of the basin, where additional hillside runoff could be captured and directed toward the fields. She worked on these projects in the short afternoon light while Tom did his schoolwork at the kitchen table inside, and she studied the frozen landscape with the same systematic attention she had given it in the warmer months, noting where snow drifted against the hillsides, which slopes would channel meltwater toward her fields when March came, and where the frozen surface cracked in patterns that revealed the subsurface movement of water she could not see, but could infer from the evidence the cold made visible. There was a loneliness to those months that she did not record in the ledger, because the ledger was for numbers, and loneliness does not convert to figures. But she felt it in the specific way that a person feels the absence of a language. She was doing serious intellectual work in complete social isolation among people who lacked the framework to evaluate what she was building, and the gap between what she knew and what she could share with anyone around her created a particular kind of silence that filled the cabin after Tom fell asleep and stayed until morning. On a night in December, she opened the ledger to record soil temperature measurements she had taken that afternoon by driving a metal rod into the ground at 3 different depths and timing how long it took her fingers to feel the cold transfer through the steel. It was not a scientific instrument. It was improvisation. It was the kind of rough measurement that Henry would have approved of because it produced usable information from available materials, and the approval of a dead man was the closest thing to professional validation she had access to in Cass County, Nebraska in the winter of 1884. She wrote the measurements, then she paused and wrote a line that was not a number. The ground responded correctly. The channels are webbing. I wish you could see it. She crossed the line out immediately. The ledger was for numbers, but the crossing out did not fully obscure the words, and they remained visible beneath the ink. A sentence caught halfway between expression and erasure, like a voice that started to speak and then decided the room was not ready to hear it. Tom was losing his Kentucky accent with the rapid thoroughness that children bring to linguistic adaptation. He had made friends at the county schoolboys who accepted him with the conditional welcome that rural children extend to newcomers who can work and keep up and not complain about conditions. One evening at supper, he referred to their cornfield as the bottom lot, using the phrase casually the way his classmates used it with a faint edge of dismissal that he had absorbed from their parents without understanding its origin or its intent. He did not notice what he had said. Margaret noticed. She did not correct him because correcting a child for repeating the ambient language of his community would accomplish nothing except making him self-conscious about words whose power he did not yet understand. Instead, she washed the dishes and thought about the mechanics of contempt, how it traveled through language from adult to child, dinner table to dinner table, following the path of least resistance, the way water follows gravity, requiring no effort, no intention, just the steady downstream pressure of assumption. Spring arrived in 1885 with the cautious incrementalism of a season that knew it might be interrupted. Margaret expanded her corn acreage and added a new element that drew fresh attention from the neighbors, a truck garden for the commercial market in the county seat. Tomatoes, cabbages, onions, and a sprawling patch of cayenne peppers that she planned to dry and sell through whatever channel would take them. The garden required steady moisture that upland farmers in Nebraska struggled to provide. Their thin prairie topsoil over ridge clay dried out between rain events, and the labor of hauling water from wells was exhausting enough that most settlers planted only what could survive on rainfall timing alone. Margaret's basin ground held its moisture between rains, releasing it slowly upward into the root zone through capillary action, and the vegetables she planted into that ground had access to a consistency of water that no amount of hauling could replicate on the ridge above. She did not explain this to anyone. She let the plants do the explaining, and plants are patient teachers. When the first vegetables were ready for market, she loaded the wagon and drove to the county seat to sell. Silas Pemberton operated the largest grain purchasing operation in the area. He was a compact man with a merchant's instinct for leverage and a face that maintained an expression of friendly concern regardless of what his mouth was saying. He examined Margaret's corn samples with professional attention and then named a price 15% below what he was paying other farmers for equivalent quality. Bottomland corn. Mrs. Holbrooke, he said, his tone carrying the reasonable sympathy of a man delivering unwelcome news he wished he didn't have to deliver. Retains more moisture than ridge corn, harder to store. Buyers in Omaha will ask questions. I'm taking a risk buying from you at any price. Margaret knew this was not true. Her corn was uniformly dry because she had harvested later in the season, after the basin's natural drainage had drawn the excess moisture down and away from the ears. Pemberton knew it too, or would have known it if he had bothered to test the moisture content rather than relying on the assumption that low-ground corn must be wet corn the way low ground must be bad ground. But Pemberton was the only buyer within 20 miles, and monopoly does not require accuracy-only leverage. Margaret did not argue, she did not accept. She loaded her unsold corn back onto the wagon, drove to the next county seat 12 miles east, and found a German grocer named Aldrich who tested her cayenne peppers by tasting one, studied the color and texture of the dried product for a full minute, and then named a price per pound that represented 3 times what equivalent acreage in corn would have yielded. Aldrich recognized quality because quality was what his customers paid him to recognize, and he did not care whether it came from ridge ground or basin ground or the surface of the moon. When Pemberton learned that Margaret had sold around him, he said nothing directly. But the following week, the price he offered Earl Dawson for corn dropped by 3 cents per bushel. It was a small reduction, the kind that could be attributed to market fluctuation, but its timing was precise enough to function as a message. Power in small communities communicates through exactly these adjustments, penalties so slight that protesting them sounds paranoid, consequences so deniable that naming them sounds accusatory. Dawson came to Margaret's fence line the following week. He was not riding past this time. He had come specifically, and the specificity was visible in the way he sat his horse facing her, squarely rather than angling past. "Mrs. Holbrooke," he said, "Pemberton dropped my price 3 cents this week, same corn as last month. I'm hearing it's connected to you selling your crop over in the next county." Margaret set down her hoe. She looked at Dawson and decided that he deserved the truth delivered without decoration. "He offered me 15% under market because I farm low ground," she said. "I declined and found a buyer who pays for quality rather than location. He didn't appreciate that." Dawson sat with this for a moment. The silence between them had a texture. He was not angry at her exactly, but he was not comfortable either because he had just discovered that a woman he had pitied had caused a consequence to his income, and the discovery required a rearrangement of assumptions that he was not yet finished making. "You're not wrong for selling your own crop, Mrs. Holbrooke," he said finally, "but you're not the only one living here." It was not an accusation, it was the observation of a man who was beginning to understand that the widow on the low ground was not a charity case requiring sympathy, but an economic actor whose decisions had effects that extended beyond her fence line. And this understanding was uncomfortable because it replaced a simpler story with a more complicated one. "Mr. Dawson," Margaret said, "Pemberton didn't drop your price because of me. He dropped it because you let him." Dawson looked at her. She could see the sentence landing, and she could see that it would take him time to process it fully. He touched his hat, turned his horse, and rode back up the hill, and Margaret watched him go and understood that she had just made either an enemy or an ally, and would not know which until circumstances forced the distinction. The second season deepened everything the first had suggested. Dawson lost a third of his corn to a 3-week dry stretch in July, his roots hitting clay hardpan at 14 inches and finding nothing below it. Margaret's corn produced without interruption through the same dry period. The truck garden flourished. Yield at season's end, 47 bushels per acre. The gap between Plat 47 and everything around it was widening, and the widening was becoming difficult to attribute to luck. In late autumn of 1885, Agnes Holbrooke arrived in Nebraska without warning. She appeared on a hired wagon on a Tuesday afternoon dressed in the careful Kentucky fashion of a woman who considered appearance a moral position, and she looked at the small cabin and the channel-scarred fields and the rough hands of her grandson with an expression that confirmed everything she had feared when she wrote that letter 6 months earlier. The confrontation was not loud. Agnes did not raise her voice because Agnes had never needed to raise her voice. She spoke in the controlled, measured tone of a woman who had perfected the art of making devastation sound like concern. "Thomas looks like a hired boy," she said, sitting at Margaret's kitchen table with a cup of coffee she had not asked for but accepted because refusing hospitality would have been beneath her standards. "His hands are calloused through. You are turning my grandson into a laborer." "I am teaching him the way Henry taught me," Margaret said. Agnes set down her cup. "Henry was taught by his father, a man, on a proper farm, not in a water hole." The words landed at the small room with the particular weight of statements that are designed not to persuade, but to wound. And they did wound because Agnes was not wrong about the facts, only about what the facts meant. Henry had been taught by a man on a proper farm with resources and community support that Margaret did not have. The question Agnes was really asking was whether a woman alone could transmit the same knowledge through the same method, and the answer to that question was standing outside on the porch, and his name was Thomas, and he had been listening. Tom came through the door. He was 14 months taller than when Agnes had last seen him, and the softness that grandmothers remember in their grandchildren had been replaced by the lean definition that physical work builds in adolescent bodies. His hands were what Agnes had described calloused and rough, but his eyes were what Margaret saw steady and serious and carrying the particular intelligence of a boy who was learning to think before he spoke because the person teaching him considered that the most important skill a farmer could possess. "Grandma," Tom said, "I want to stay here." His voice was not angry. It was calm in the specific way that Margaret recognized as Henry's legacy, the controlled, deliberate cadence of someone who places words rather than simply speaking them, who treats language as a tool that works best when used with precision. Agnes looked at her grandson for a long time. Then she looked at Margaret. Then she looked at her grandson again. She stayed 3 days. She did not raise the subject again. She watched Tom work the fields with a competence that she could not reconcile with the narrative of neglect she had carried from Kentucky, and this failure of reconciliation produced a silence that filled the cabin alongside the silence of the winter wind and the silence of the 3 people in it who were each thinking about the same dead man and reaching different conclusions about what he would have wanted. On the morning Agnes left, she placed something on the kitchen table. Henry's pocket watch. She had kept it when Margaret sold everything else in Kentucky, claiming it as a grandmother's right to hold a piece of her son. Now she set it on the rough pine surface beside the coffee cups and said 2 words. "His father's." She did not clarify whether she was giving it back or giving it up. She climbed onto the hired wagon and did not look back as it carried her up the hill road and out of the basin, and Margaret stood in the doorway holding the watch, feeling its weight, feeling the chain coil against her palm, and understanding that she had just witnessed either a surrender or a benediction, and that Agnes herself might not know which it was. The summer of 1886 arrived with the casual cruelty of a Nebraska weather system that has decided to make a point. The rains that should have come in the second week of June simply did not come. The rains that should have followed a week later also did not come. By the end of the month, the prairie had taken on the particular quality of suppressed alarm that farming communities develop when the sky is not performing as expected. Conversations at the general store shifted to weather the way conversations always shift to the one subject that cannot be controlled, as though speaking of it might summon a corrective response. Rainfall dropped to less than a third of the seasonal average. Creeks reduced to trickles and then to dry sandy beds that cracked along their margins. Wells dropped 8 feet in 2 months, and farmers who had never needed to think about their water tables found themselves measuring the depth with rope and bucket Before dawn, checking the slow decline the way a man checks the level in a barrel he knows is not being refilled. The ridge ground farms went first. The topsoil was what it was, thin and compacted, sitting over clay that held no water and allowed no roots through. Those soils exhausted their moisture reserves within 3 weeks, and then there was simply nothing to draw on. Corn that had looked promising in May turned to rustling brown stalks by mid-July, the leaves curling and bleaching at their edges, in the way that indicates a plant that has abandoned the current season and is conserving what remains for seed. Dawson lost most of his crop. Sums lost 60%. Clayton Sutter, who had claimed the best high ground on the same day Margaret had filed on Plat 47, and who had told anyone willing to listen that the widow had made a terrible mistake, watched his crop fail so completely that by August he was forced to consider borrowing against his land title to purchase feed corn for his livestock through the winter. On Plat 47, the drought changed almost nothing. Margaret walked her cornfield on a Tuesday morning in late July while the county around her burned. The corn stood tall and producing silk at the top of ears that were filling at the normal pace. She moved through the rows with her hand trailing along the stalks, feeling the thickness, the turgidity in the leaves that indicated full hydration, and she made a note in the ledger. When she returned to the house, Tom was standing at the gate. He was 14 now, growing fast, beginning to resemble Henry, in the way he stood with his weight distributed evenly on both feet, arms at his sides, watching a thing until he understood it. "Mom," he said, "Mr. Dawson came by this morning, asked if you had water to sell." Margaret stopped. "Sell water? I told him you don't sell water. You don't have extra water either. You just have dirt that holds water better." Margaret looked at her son. He had just described the essential principle of her entire operation in 2 sentences, a compression that would take her 2 hours to communicate to an adult who didn't want to hear it. "You told him right," she said, and they both understood she was not only talking about water. Sutter did not accept the contrast between his dead fields and Margaret's living ones. He began telling neighbors that she must be diverting creek water, illegally blocking flow that should have continued downstream for others to use. It was not true, but in the context of drought, when everyone was losing and looking for explanations, his story had the seductive appeal of every simple answer to a complicated question. Someone was winning while they were losing, and the simplest explanation was that someone was cheating. Ruth Gatlin carried the narrative further. At church on a Sunday morning in August, she said loudly enough for Margaret to hear from 3 pews back, "Maybe someone should check where the water's going before we decide who's a good farmer and who's just good at taking their neighbor's share." Margaret sat still. Beside her, Tom's fist tightened on his thigh. She put her hand over his fist, not to comfort him, but to hold him in place because he was 14 and beginning to have opinions about justice that he had not yet learned to express without damage. That night, after Tom was asleep, Margaret sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open in front of her and the pen in her hand and did not write. For the first time since Henry's death, she allowed herself to consider the full weight of what she was facing, not the drought she had planned for, not the failing neighbors. Their failure was predictable and she took no pleasure in it. What she had not planned for was the possibility that being right about the science would not protect her from being wrong about the politics. If Sutter's accusation gained enough momentum, if the county decided to investigate her channel system, if someone who did not understand hydrology interpreted her earthworks as diversion rather than management, she could lose the land. Not because she had done anything wrong, but because the people making the judgment lacked the knowledge to distinguish between what she had built and what Sutter was describing. She sat with until the candle burned down to a stub and the cabin went dark. And in the darkness, for the first time since Henry died, she cried, Silently, because Tom was in the next room and the walls were thin, and a mother's grief is a sound that children should not have to carry. But her face was wet, and she let it stay wet for a while before she wiped it, because there are moments when the body needs to do what the mind will not permit, and this was one of them. Then she lit a new candle, she opened the ledger, and she recorded the channel water level she had measured that afternoon, because if anyone came to investigate, she would have data. And data does not care who is afraid and who is angry and who is lying. Data simply is. The community meeting in November was held in the county hall, a room that smelled of lamp oil and damp wool, and the particular tension that gathers when frightened people assemble to discuss things they cannot control. Sutter stood and formally proposed that the county investigate whether Margaret Holbrooke had violated water usage rights by diverting natural water flow from the shared watershed. He spoke with the measured authority of a man who was accustomed to being listened to, and his proposal carried weight because he was a large taxpayer, a prominent voice, and the drought had created an environment in which anyone who had water was automatically a suspect. The room went quiet. Faces turned toward Margaret. She was sitting in the back row with Tom beside her, and she could feel the collective attention of the room settling on her, the way sunlight settles on a single object when the clouds part, illuminating it completely and without mercy. She stood. She spoke in the English she had been building carefully for 2 years, words chosen with precision, sentences constructed for clarity rather than eloquence, because eloquence was a luxury she could not afford, and clarity was the only tool that would serve her in this room. "I welcome any inspection," she said. "Anyone who wants to see my channels any day, I invite you. My channels do not block the creek. They direct rainwater that falls on the hillsides, water that would flow onto my land, whether the channels existed or not, into my fields instead of letting it run straight through to the creek. I am not taking anyone's water. I am keeping water that my land already receives." The room was silent. Sutter sat down. No one voted to support the investigation, but no one spoke in Margaret's defense either. The silence had the particular quality of a community that was not yet willing to choose a side and was hoping the problem would resolve itself without requiring anyone to commit. Then Earl Dawson stood up. He was sitting in the middle of the room, and he had been silent throughout the meeting, and when he rose, there was a slight stiffness in the movement that suggested he had been deciding whether to rise for some time and had only just completed the decision. He did not look at Margaret. He looked at Sutter. "I've been to Mrs. Holbrook's land," he said. "I've seen her channels. They don't block the creek. I'm not an expert, but I have eyes." He sat down. He said nothing more. It was the first time anyone had spoken publicly in Margaret's support. Not because Dawson had changed his mind about bottomland farming. He still believed privately that high ground was the proper choice for a sensible farmer, and he would continue to believe this for another year before the evidence overwhelmed the belief. But he had looked at the channels, and he had seen what they did, and he was not a man who lied, and when forced to choose between the comfort of silence and the truth he had witnessed with his own eyes, he chose the truth. The choice cost him something. Sutter was a neighbor, a fellow customer of Pemberton's, a man who sat in the same pew on Sundays. Speaking against him in public was a withdrawal from a social account that Dawson had been building for years, and he made the withdrawal because he judged the cost of silence to be higher. Margaret caught his eye as she walked out of the hall. She nodded. One nod, he understood it. Dawson came to her door the following week. He sat at the kitchen table, accepted coffee, and asked directly what she had done differently, that her land had survived what had destroyed everything around it. Margaret did not explain the theory. She had explained it once to herself in the ledger, and she saw no reason to give a lecture when a demonstration would do the job better and faster. She took him outside. She drove a spade into her field soil and turned it over. moist at 18 inches, dark dense threaded with root fibers. Then she walked him up the hill to the edge of his own property and drove the spade in again. Dry at 12 inches. Below that hard gray clay, compacted and impermeable, a wall that roots could not penetrate and water could not pass. 2 spadefuls. They said everything that 2 hours of explanation could have said, and said it in a language that a man who worked with his hands understood immediately and completely. She told him he could improve his soil. Systematic composting would build the organic layer he lacked. That would take 10 years. A cistern to capture roof runoff for garden irrigation could be built in a week. 10 years in 1 week. Dawson thanked her and left. Tom came into the kitchen. Will he do it? The cistern, yes. 10 years of composting, we'll see. Tom thought about this. He stood up for you at the meeting. He stood up for the truth, Margaret corrected. I happened to be the one telling it at the time. Tom looked at his mother. You sound like Dad. It was the best thing he knew how to say. The harvest figures that autumn were devastating in the context of what surrounded them. The county average collapsed to 11 bushels per acre, the worst in a decade. Margaret's Basin ground produced 38. The truck garden, sustained by soil that had never fully dried, produced at a rate that overwhelmed the county seat's market demand and required her to contract with Aldrich in Omaha to take the surplus at prices that still cleared significant profit despite the transport cost. The cayenne crop failed partially because even deep soil has limits, but what she brought to market, she sold at prices the drought had inflated considerably. That evening, Margaret opened the ledger and recorded the third season's numbers. She closed it, then opened it again. She turned to the page where Agnes's letter was still pressed between the leaves. She read the line again. If you cannot provide for Thomas properly, send him home to me. She took the pen and wrote on the back of the letter, not a reply to Agnes, a note to herself. Thomas is where he belongs. I am where I belong. The land knows. Now I know too. She folded the letter and placed it in the drawer of the kitchen table. Not in the ledger. The ledger was for numbers. The drawer was for things that were finished. Daniel Crew arrived in Cass County on a cold afternoon in October of 1886, carrying a leather bag, a letter of introduction from Margaret's cousin in Louisville, and the quiet confidence of a young man who had grown up with his hands in Kentucky bottomland soil and understood what that soil could do because he had watched it do it since he was old enough to hold a seed. He was 22, lean in the way that men who work outdoors from adolescence become lean, with the economy of movement that distinguishes people who have learned that wasted effort is wasted time, and wasted time on a farm is wasted food. He stood at Margaret's door and handed her the letter and waited while she read it, and when she looked up and studied his face for the signs she was looking for, whatever she found there satisfied her because she folded the letter and said, "Can you start tomorrow?" And he said, "I can start now," and that was the entirety of his interview. Daniel understood the channel system the moment he walked the fields. He did not ask Margaret to explain it. He read it the way she had read the survey map at Pruitt's table, with the recognition of someone encountering a familiar language written in unfamiliar handwriting. He knelt at the junction where 2 channels met and watched the water distribute itself along the paths Margaret had cut. And he nodded once, and Margaret saw in that nod something she had not experienced in nearly 4 years: comprehension without translation. That evening, after Tom had gone to bed, Margaret and Daniel sat at the kitchen table and she opened Henry's ledger. She turned through the pages season by season, pointing to entries and explaining the decisions behind the numbers. Daniel listened the way a musician listens to someone play a piece he already knows, hearing not the notes, but the interpretation. The places where the performer lingered or accelerated the choices that revealed understanding beyond the technical. It was the first time since Henry's death that Margaret had spoken about her work with someone who did not need to be convinced of its validity before the conversation could begin. The relief of it was physical. She felt it in her shoulders, which lowered by a fraction she had not known they were carrying, and in her voice, which found a register she had almost forgotten the tone she used when she was thinking aloud rather than defending a position. Daniel's presence on the farm allowed Margaret to double the cultivated acreage of Plat 47, but it also created an adjustment that she had not anticipated. Tom, at 15, had spent 3 years as the second adult on the property. He had grown into the role with a competence that exceeded his age, carrying responsibilities that would have taxed many grown men, and his position in the small hierarchy of the Holbrooke farm had been clear and uncontested. Margaret decided and Tom executed, and the partnership between them had developed the particular efficiency of two people who have worked together long enough to anticipate each other's movements. Daniel's arrival rearranged that hierarchy. He was older, stronger, and possessed a depth of practical knowledge that Tom was still years from matching. Tom did not resent Daniel because resentment was not in his composition, but he recalibrated. He asked fewer questions at the dinner table. He dug more and talked less. He took the tasks that did not require consultation and executed them with a focused independence that looked like maturity but felt to Margaret like retreat. She recognized what was happening because she had watched it happen before in Kentucky when a new hand joined Henry's crew and the existing workers adjusted their positions to accommodate the addition. She did not intervene. Some lessons cannot be taught by instruction. Tom needed to learn that the presence of someone more skilled than himself at a particular task did not diminish his value, and that lesson could only be absorbed through the experience of living alongside it until the discomfort wore through to understanding. By spring of 1887, the farm had reached a level of production that placed it among the serious operations in the county. 4 draft horses, a proper 2-bottom plow, a dairy herd of 6 cows whose consistently moist pasture grass stayed productive longer into dry seasons than any upland pasture in the township. The dairy produced butter and cream that Margaret delivered to the county seat twice weekly, and the butter had a pale gold color that spoke of deep-rooted, well-nourished grass, and the people who bought it noticed the quality without understanding its source. The spring brought Silas Pemberton back into Margaret's story, and this time his approach was more sophisticated than a discounted price. Pemberton rode out to Earl Dawson's Ridge Farm on a morning in April and sat at Dawson's kitchen table and made a proposition that was designed to sound like a favor. If Dawson would buy Plat 47 from Margaret or persuade her to sell, Pemberton would guarantee top market price for every bushel Dawson produced for the next 3 years, a locked-in price, a guaranteed buyer. Security in an industry where security was the one thing nobody could purchase. That land deserves someone who can use it properly, Pemberton said, meaning someone who was not Margaret, meaning someone who would sell through Pemberton's operation rather than driving 60 miles to Omaha. Dawson listened to the entire proposition without interrupting, which was his way, and then he declined. He did not explain his reasons because his reasons were not Pemberton's business, and because the reasons were complicated in ways that Dawson himself was still sorting through. What he knew with certainty was that Pemberton was asking him to take something from a woman who had built it with her own hands, and regardless of what Dawson thought about bottomland farming, or women farming alone, or the proper order of agricultural society, taking was taking, and he was not a man who took. He rode down to Margaret's property that afternoon and told her what had happened. He told her directly without softening, because he had learned over 3 years that Margaret preferred information delivered clean. Pemberton wants me to buy your land or talk you into selling, he said. Offered me a 3-year contract at top price if I did. I turned him down, thought you should know. Margaret was standing at the kitchen window when he said it, and she did not move for a moment. She was calculating not the financial implications, but the social ones, measuring the weight of what Dawson had just done against the weight of what it had cost him. You lost a 3-year guaranteed price because you said no, she said. Dawson looked out the window toward her fields. The corn was already up, already showing the vigor that 3 years of channel management and deep soil nutrition had made routine on Plat 47. You'd lose more than that if you had to sell, he said. The sentence sat in the room between them, and Margaret understood that something had shifted in the structure of their relationship. Dawson had moved from neighbor to ally, not through agreement about agricultural theory, but through an act that cost him money and comfort and the easy goodwill of a powerful man in the community. Alliance built on sacrifice holds in ways that alliance built on agreement does not, because sacrifice cannot be undone by a change of opinion. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me, Dawson said. Just keep growing corn that makes Pemberton nervous. He stood to leave. At the door he paused and turned back. You know, Mrs. Holbrooke, 3 years ago I figured you'd quit before Christmas. You and Clayton Sutter, Margaret said. He bet $5. Dawson laughed. It was a short, genuine sound, surprising in its spontaneity. I only thought it. Didn't have the nerve to bet money. Sutter was always more confident than me. More confident, yes, Margaret said. More correct, no. Dawson laughed again as he mounted his horse, and Margaret heard the sound from the yard and recognized it for what it was, the sound of a man who had just decided he liked someone he had previously only pitied, and the transition had happened without either of them needing to announce it. The summer of 1887 brought visitors to Plat 47 with a frequency and a quality of attention that would have been unimaginable 2 years earlier. Farmers who had spent the drought watching their fields die while Margaret's flourished began arriving with specific questions and purposeful notebooks. They walked the channel system during rain events, observing how the water behaved, asking questions that grew increasingly sophisticated as the afternoon's observation gave them context to formulate them. Margaret answered every question with patient thoroughness. She had no incentive to conceal what she knew. The principles she shared were universal, but their application required the specific terrain conditions her basin provided. She could afford to be generous because geography had already given her a protection that secrecy could not improve. Sutter did not come, but his teenage son did. The boy appeared at the fence line on a Wednesday afternoon alone and stood watching the water move through the channels with the concentrated attention of someone seeing something he had been told was one thing and discovering it was another. Tom was working in the vegetable garden 30 yards away, and when he looked up and saw who was standing at the fence, he set down his hoe and walked over. They stood on opposite sides of the wire, two boys roughly the same age, separated by a fence and by 4 years of their parents' history. My father says this land is just lucky, the Sutter boy said. Tom looked at him. Your father is mortgaging his property to buy feed corn through winter. My mother is selling surplus to Omaha. Which one of them sounds lucky to you? The Sutter boy did not answer, but he came back the following week, and the week after that. Each time he stayed longer and asked more questions, and Tom answered them because Margaret had taught him that knowledge has no reason to seek revenge, and the son is not the father, and the boy, standing at a fence wanting to understand something, deserves the understanding regardless of whose name he carries. Ruth Gatlin returned to Plat 47 that summer, but she came as a different woman than the one who had brought bread and pity 3 years earlier. Her husband had died the previous winter of pneumonia, and she was facing the reality of managing a farm alone A reality that had seemed abstract and pitiable when it applied to Margaret and had become concrete and terrifying now that it applied to herself. She sat at Margaret's kitchen table and did not ask about channels or soil depth or water management. She asked a question that had nothing to do with agriculture and everything to do with survival. How did you do it the first years alone? Margaret looked at her for a long time. She remembered the bread basket. She remembered the nod of agreement when Sutter dismissed her success. She remembered the church comment about taking neighbors' water. She held all of these memories in her mind simultaneously and measured them against the woman sitting across from her. Now a woman whose eyes carried the specific exhaustion of someone who has recently discovered that the world is harder than she believed, and that the people she had pitied were stronger than she had imagined. I wasn't alone, Margaret said. I had the land and I had Tom, but there were times when that wasn't enough. Ruth did not apologize for the things she had said and done over the previous 3 years. Margaret did not ask for an apology. They drank coffee and talked about practical matters, grain prices, fence repair, when to cut hay, how to negotiate with Pemberton without losing leverage. In the practical conversation, there was a reconciliation that required no declaration. The kind that occurs when shared circumstance replaces judgment and neither party needs to acknowledge that the judgment ever existed. The County Agricultural Extension Office sent a young man named Leonard Marsh to Plat 47 in late August. He had a degree in scientific agriculture from the college in Lincoln and a notebook he carried everywhere, and the earnest precision of someone who believed that measuring things was the first step toward understanding them. He spent 2 days on the property taking soil samples at various depths, recording channel dimensions, walking the perimeter to study the relationship between the basin and the surrounding hills. He asked Margaret detailed technical questions, and she answered them in the language she had absorbed from the agricultural bulletins and from the dictionary she consulted systematically to build her English vocabulary in the domain she most needed it. There was a moment during his visit that he did not include in his report. He asked where she had learned these techniques, and Margaret was quiet for a few seconds before answering. My husband, she said, and his father before him, and his father before that. Marsh wrote in his notebook, multi-generational family tradition. 3 words to represent 3 lifetimes of accumulated knowledge. 3 lifetimes of standing in mud and watching water and recording what happened and adjusting what didn't work. Margaret watched him write the 3 words and said nothing, because what could she say that each of those generations had contained a full human life, with its own joys and failures and lessons learned at the cost of seasons lost, that her husband had died with the knowledge still in his hands, and she had carried it across a state line in a trunk with his tools, that the distance between 3 words in a notebook and 3 lifetimes of practice was the distance between a map and the country it described. She said nothing. Some distances cannot be closed with language. Marsh's report was published in abbreviated form in the County Agricultural Bulletin the following spring. It described the Basin Farm's performance in terms the farming community could not easily dispute. A 5-year average yield that exceeded the county average by 70%. A drought year differential that defied conventional assumptions about low ground productivity. A total gross income that placed Plat 47 among the top 5 producing farms in the county by revenue per improved acre. The report credited the performance to soil composition, natural water retention, and what Marsh called systematic water management through surface channeling. The county fair of 1888 was held on a clear September weekend when the light across the Nebraska prairie had the golden quality of a season preparing to turn. Margaret entered 11 categories. She placed first in 7, Her corn samples were so consistently large in kernel size and uniform in ear development that the judging committee examined them twice. The year had been broadly average in rainfall and temperature, which meant that the basin's advantages during stress conditions had not even been deployed. The produce had simply been grown in very good soil with very good management and had therefore been very good produce. The committee discussed the results privately before posting them because the numbers seemed implausible to men who had been farming the county for a decade, and implausible results required either an explanation or a posting, and since no explanation presented itself, they posted. Margaret was standing near the results board when Clayton Sutter walked past. He stopped. He had been looking at the board from a distance, and now he was looking at it from close enough to read every name and every number, and Margaret was close enough to watch him read. 4 years between them. The $5 bet at Pruitt's table, the dismissal at church, the accusation of water theft, the investigation proposal at the community meeting. All of it compressed into the space between two people standing 2 steps apart on a county fairground on a Saturday afternoon. Sutter did not apologize. Apology was not in his vocabulary, the way it was not in the vocabulary of most men who had built their identities on the assumption of their own correctness. But he looked at her and he said 2 words, "Good land," as though the land itself were the explanation. As though the land had done it alone, without the woman who had read it and designed for it and managed it through drought and skepticism and loneliness, and the particular endurance required to be right in the company of people who are certain you are wrong. Margaret could have said many things. She could have reminded him of the bet. She could have pointed out that the land had been available to anyone in that line, and every one of them had rejected it. She could have allowed herself the satisfaction of a moment she had earned through 5 years of work that would have broken most people and that had only bent her. Instead, she said, "The land was always good. You could always have asked." Then she stepped past him and continued walking, and that was everything they said to each other, and it was enough. Not because the words were sufficient, but because sufficiency was not the point. The point was that the land had made its argument, and the argument was posted on the board behind them in numbers that did not require interpretation, and Margaret had decided long ago that she would let the soil speak for her because the soil did not need to win an argument to be right. It simply needed to produce, and it had produced, and the production was the only vindication she had ever wanted. Tom was waiting for her near the livestock barn. She had entered butter in the dairy competition, and the ribbon for first place was in her hand pale blue against her work-roughened fingers. She folded it and gave it to him. "You did most of the milking," she said. He took it. He was 16 now, taller than her, with his father's serious eyes and her own habit of watching carefully before reaching a conclusion. He would take over the farm's operation eventually, and she was teaching him the way Henry had taught her, not through instruction, so much as through the daily practice of paying attention to what the land was doing and what it was capable of and what it needed from the people who stood on it. He held the ribbon and looked at it and did not say thank you because thank you was not large enough for what the ribbon represented, and he knew it, and she knew he knew it, and the knowing was enough. Property assessment notices arrived in early autumn. The county had reassessed values across the township, and Plat 47 had increased in assessed value by 61% since Margaret had filed on it 4 years earlier. The surrounding ridge parcels had increased between 12 and 20%, a normal appreciation reflecting general settlement growth. The Basin farm had been revalued because the record of its productivity had made its potential legible to county assessors who work primarily from yield data. From a filing fee of $30 to an appraised market value of $720. The ridge parcels of equivalent acreage sat between 280 and 400. She had taken the land nobody wanted and made it worth more than any comparable piece of ground in the township. Harlan Pruitt encountered her at the general store in October. He was older now, his hair thinner, his eyes carrying the accumulated experience of a man who had watched hundreds of settlers make hundreds of decisions and had learned that the decisions he remembered most vividly were the ones that had surprised him. "I've been thinking about that spring day in '84, he said, when you pointed at Plat 47. I've been wondering for a while now what you saw in those contour lines that the other men missed." She told him. The hills, the water table, the soil depth, the creek. She told him about the Ohio River bottomland and the way Henry had kept yield records and what those records had taught both of them about the relationship between water and fertility. Pruitt listened with the focused attention of a man re-examining an assumption he had held as fact. "You knew that ground was worth more than anyone was paying for it," he said. "I thought it was worth more than the other men believed," she said. "The ground had to prove it." This was accurate. She had not been certain. She had been informed. There is a distance between those two things that looks like confidence from the outside and feels like a carefully managed bet from the inside. The kind of wager a person makes when they have done enough calculation to believe the odds favor them, but not so much that they have confused probability with guarantee. The Grange meeting the following spring extended Margaret membership after several years of watching the numbers and finally deciding that the widow on the Basin ground understood farming well enough to have a seat at the table where county agricultural strategy was discussed. She was the only woman at that meeting, and she sat in a wooden chair at the back of the hall and listened to men discuss land prices and crop rotation and water access until the floor was open for comment. She stood and said in the English she had been building word by word for 5 years that the most important thing she had learned in Nebraska was that the land always knows more than the men standing on it, and that reading it takes longer than claiming it. Nobody wrote that down. But a farmer named Albert Poole, who had been struggling for 3 seasons on mediocre ridge ground, went home afterward and spent a week walking his property the way she had described, watching where water went, noting where soil darkened, mapping the micro-topography the way she had mapped the basin. He found a low corner of his south field that he had been plowing around for years as unsuitable ground. He channeled it. He let it work. 2 seasons later, that corner was outperforming the rest of his field by 30%. Poole came to tell her about it on a Saturday morning, standing at her gate with his hat in his hands, in the particular expression of a man who has discovered that something he dismissed for years was more valuable than everything he kept. Margaret was pleased but not surprised. She had never believed that her success was unreplicable. She had believed that it was specific, that the principles were universal, but the application required reading each piece of ground individually, and Poole's low corner was a different document than her basin, written in a different hand but in the same language. On a night in late autumn of 1889, the 5th anniversary of her filing at Pruitt's table, Margaret sat at the kitchen table after Tom and Daniel had gone to bed. The farm's income that year, from corn from the market garden, from dairy, from cayenne peppers, that now supplied 2 grocers in Omaha and 1 in Lincoln, through the Aldrich connection that had outlasted Pemberton's attempts to undercut it, exceeded what most county farmers earned by a margin she counted privately and did not discuss. She opened the ledger. Henry's handwriting began on the first page the careful notations of their first Kentucky season, the soil temperatures and rainfall measurements, and yield projections of a man who believed that observation was the foundation of understanding. She turned through the pages, passing Henry's last entries and reaching her own 5 years of Nebraska data, recorded in her own hand, a continuation of a conversation that death had interrupted but not ended. She turned to the next blank page and wrote, "Fifth year, the land has spoken. I do not need it to say more." She closed the ledger and placed it on the shelf beside Henry's pocket watch, the one Agnes had left on this same table 3 years ago. The watch and the ledger sat side by side, two artifacts of a man who had been dead for 7 years, but whose influence was still producing measurable effects in the soil of a Nebraska basin and in the hands of the woman who had carried his knowledge across the state line and laid it down on ground that confirmed what the knowledge predicted. She looked out the window. The basin was dark, but she knew every channel, every bed, every place where water pooled and where it flowed. She knew this land the way Henry had known the Kentucky bottomland, not by sight in this moment, but by the accumulation of thousands of moments of observation, thousands of measurements, thousands of small decisions that added up across 5 growing seasons to the difference between the land nobody wanted and the most productive farm in the township. Then she heard a sound from the kitchen table behind her and turned. Tom was sitting where she had been sitting a moment before. The ledger was open in front of him. He had a pen in his hand. He was writing. Not schoolwork. He was recording soil moisture measurements he had taken that afternoon, figures he had gathered on his own initiative using the same method Margaret used, the same method Henry had used, the same method Henry's father had used. The data was entered in Tom's own handwriting, which looked nothing like Henry's and nothing like Margaret's. It was his own hand, his own way of forming numbers and letter, but the structure of the entry, the date first, then the location, then the measurement, then a single line of observation was identical to the format Henry had established it in the first season of the first ledger, a format that had now been transmitted through 4 generations, not through instruction, but through the contagion of proximity, the way a child absorbs the patterns of the people he lives beside until those patterns become his own. 4 generations now. The ledger was continuing. Margaret stood in the doorway longer than she needed to. She watched her son write, and she saw in the angle of his concentration, in the steadiness of his hands, something that she had been building toward for 5 years without fully knowing it. The farm was not the achievement. The channels were not the achievement. The yields and the ribbons and the assessed value and the grudging respect of men who had bet against her were not the achievement. This was the achievement. A boy sitting at a table recording what the land told him in the tradition of people who understood that paying attention was the highest form of respect you could offer the ground that fed you. She walked into the kitchen. She poured 2 cups of coffee, set one beside Tom's elbow, and sat down across from him with the latest agricultural bulletin from Lincoln. They read and wrote in silence until the candle burned low, the kind of silence that only people who do the same work and understand each other completely can share. Tom inherited the farm when Margaret died in 1911. He was 39 years old, a man by then with children of his own, and the same serious eyes and the same habit of observation and the same ledger continued now for decades, recording what the land did and what it needed and what it gave in return for the attention it received. He farmed the basin on the same principles Margaret had established, maintaining the channel network, extending it as he learned more about the property's specific hydrology, teaching his own children to walk the Lent in rain and after rain and in the long, slow winter, watching where the water went and what it carried and what it left behind. The soil in the basin continued to deepen with each year's addition of organic matter. The water table remained more stable than the surrounding landscape through every dry year the prairie delivered. The farm continued to produce at rates that the neighbors tracked with a quiet, accumulated respect that eventually replaces initial skepticism when the evidence has made itself too clear to ignore. It was the kind of respect that does not announce itself, that exists in the way people mention a name in conversation, without qualification, without explanation, as a reference point that everyone in the room understands. Margaret Holbrooke had chosen the piece of land nobody wanted. She had done it with her eyes open and her knowledge intact, and her husband's tools in the trunk, and a clear understanding of what she was choosing and why. The sympathy of her neighbors had been a kindness she did not require and a mistake she had no reason to correct before the harvest spoke for itself. The ground always knew what it was worth. She had simply been the first one standing on it who knew how to listen. If this story of practical wisdom, earning its proof over 5 hard seasons, found its way to something useful in you, we'd be grateful if you'd subscribe. There are more documented accounts of this kind of knowledge, the kind that gets dismissed before it gets vindicated, and we'll keep bringing them as long as you keep watching.